April 15, 2018. Russia prepares for strikes on Saudi Arabia after chemical weapon attack fears in Yemen grow, orders heavy bombers to stay in Iran. An astonishing new Security Council (SC) report circulating in the Kremlin today reveals that Russia is in the process of preparing for military strikes upon Saudi Arabia over its use of chemical and biological weapons in Yemen that is due to the apocalyptic situation in Yemen about to get much worse after Jaish al-Islam terrorists leaving Syria are now flowing there in massive numbers, and who in the past have used chemical weapons against Syrian Kurds, with the greatest fears of the General Staff being of a superbug just discovered in Yemen by Médecins Sans Frontières (MSF). Doctors Without Borders scientists who are now warning has mutated into a new bacterium that poses a catastrophic risk to the entire world, and with Russia's first action in this potential strike against Saudi Arabia being the ordering of its heavy bombers in Iran to stay there until further orders are received, while Moscow builds a US, UK and French coalition to begin these attacks. According to this report, in the hours leading up to yesterday's United Nations Security Council UNSC meeting, where Russia put forth a resolution condemning the American-led military masturbation attack upon Syria over unproven allegations of a chemical attack, President Putin pointed out to his Western counterparts that the logic they were using to justify their illegal attack could, in turn, be used by Russia to launch strikes against Saudi Arabia, with the West's new standard for allowing any country to attack another being best articulated by France's UN ambassador François Delattre, who stated the use of chemical weapons cannot be tolerated and must be deterred. That is essential. Siding with Russia's position that unproven chemical weapons use accusations failed to meet United Nations standards for one country launching an attack on another law of war, this report continues, were China and Bolivia, with Ethiopia, Kazakhstan, Equatorial Guinea and Peru abstaining from voting because they needed more information, but with the Western-aligned nations of the US, UK, France, Netherlands, Sweden, Kuwait, Poland and Ivory Coast voting to reject the United Nations' decades-long justified reasons to start wars with their, instead, creating a new paradigm allowing any nation to attack another based on nothing more than the standard of "we believe it happened, so it's true." Quickly adopting this new United Nations standard wanted by the West of "we believe it happened, so it's true" in order to legally justify one nation attacking another, this report details, was President Putin, and who, during today's Security Council meeting, presented evidence that Saudi Arabia has been supplying ISIL and Nusra Front terrorists with chemical weapons and chemical ingredients for building such weapons, with Yemeni Armed Forces spokesman Brigadier General Sharaf Khalid also having previously documented the extensive use of chemical and biological weapons by Saudi-led forces in Yemen's Marib province. Even more barbaric, this report notes, General Sharaf Khalid, this past October 2017, stunningly revealed that the true cause of Yemen's cholera outbreak that has become the worst in our world's entire history, and who shockingly stated, poisonous gases were spread in the sky after the US, Saudi and Israeli fighter jets' direct airstrikes, and they came down to the ground with the rain and penetrated and contaminated our underground waters. Therefore, it was a biological war, as Saudi Arabia has already used all types of banned weapons against us. While the West is manically cheering itself for its completely failed strike on Syria over unproven chemical weapon use allegations, that even the Jaish al-Islam terrorists who concocted this fake news story at the urging of their British Secret Services handlers are now calling a farce, this report continues, completely being ignored by these Western warmongers is what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, and whose description as a war by the US-led mainstream propaganda media is as grossly obscene as it is inaccurate, as its true purpose is the total extermination of that nation's millions of Islamic Shiite peoples in what has become one of the largest genocides in human history. As the Western-sponsored genocide in Yemen has now grown to such evil and demonic depths that UN humanitarian chief Mark Lowcock, after recently visiting there, shockingly intoned that it looks like the apocalypse while warning that unless the situation changes, we're going to have the world's worst humanitarian disaster for 50 years, this report details. Saudi Arabia's total blockade on allowing food into Yemen has caused the starvation deaths of at least 150,000 in the last year alone, but whose real and verifiable deaths the American people aren't allowed to know about in order to weigh against the supposed, but never found, 40 or so Syrians supposedly killed by chemicals last week to determine which nation, in fact, they should be attacking for crimes against humanity. To how Saudi Arabia has been able to keep its massive genocidal crimes against humanity in Yemen hidden from the American people, this report explains, is due to their conducting one of the largest public relations campaigns of outright deception in U.S. history, costing a staggering $1.5 billion, and whose efforts have led to the buying off of the entire U.S. mainstream propaganda media establishment, as well as top U.S. politicians, led by Corvus Missile Group and Booz Allen Hamilton, with the latter being a U.S. management consultancy with long-established links to the deep state and who, also, was involved in the illegal SWIFT and PRISM mass surveillance programs revealed by Edward Snowden. To what has placed Saudi Arabia's genocidal actions in Yemen at the forefront of Russian military and political consideration as a vital national security threat to the entire federation, this report grimly notes, are the grave reports being issued by Doctors Without Borders scientists about what is now happening in Yemen due to the Saudis' unrestrained biological and chemical use, with these scientists warning that this conflict is taking on aspects of warfare once found only in history books, when the real toll of a military campaign is not the immediate damage from weapons, but the long-term and far greater impact of disease that spread in the chaos of armed conflict. First noticed by U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, this report explains, the Americans, by 2009, realized that a never-before-known bacterium was circulating throughout the Middle East that no antibiotic could cure, known as a superbug, and that due to the Saudis' use of biological and chemical weapons in Yemen, has now mutated into what is being called the Acinetobacter baumannii, and whose deadly virulence is so feared, even the U.S. has labeled it as a national security threat. For anyone believing that the already apocalyptic situation in Yemen, due to the Saudis being allowed by their Western backers to use chemical and biological weapons against that nation's innocent peoples, couldn't possibly get any worse, this report concludes, they'd be gravely mistaken as the British-led and controlled Jaish al-Islam terrorists from Syria who primarily attack civilian targets via kidnappings and bombings, and launches rockets into Israel, are now being deployed to Yemen via Saudi Arabia, with the Saudis' not-so-secret reason for doing so being these Jaish al-Islam terrorists having freely admitted that they used chemical weapons in a mainly Kurdish-populated area in the city of Aleppo, northern Syria, in April 2016, and that under the new United Nations war standard just imposed on the world by the Americans, now makes Saudi Arabia a legitimate and legal target for destruction by Russian military forces, and is why President Putin has just instructed the General Staff to begin talks with the US, UK and France in order to build a coalition to strike these chemical weapon-using animals as soon as possible, and that, of course, none of these Western powers could possibly object to, as to decide anything otherwise would expose them on the world stage as being liars and hypocrites. President Putin remains confident that the US, UK and France will join Russian coalition to bomb Saudi Arabia until it quits using chemical and biological weapons in Yemen.